get into our first Spark talk. And I'm just going to get our, so that's our robot. Let's remove that. That's the robot here that you see. That's going to be the face of the robot. So that's my face, my neck. So that's my head. And that's the body of the robot. Yeah? And the robot's going to be projected on the screens there. So we have Jason, and I'm going to first put him online and then talk about him.
Hey!
Thank you, Jason. Okay, what we're going to do, I'm going to do a good introduction for you, okay? And then
Okay.
I hand it over to you, and you can, start your Spark talk. So, can you see everyone here?
Yes.
Yeah? Do you want to move the robot a bit to take a good look at everybody else?
Let's see.
You have a few familiar faces. That's Rich, that's Andrea. I don't know, who else? Even, no, you haven't met Jason. Oh, but he's there.
Awesome.
Okay, so I'm just going to introduce you, Jason. So give me 2 minutes to do that. All right, so let's get into our first Spark talk and opening keynote, for which I'd like to introduce our lean change management guru, Jason Little, who dials into or lands in through our robot right now from Canada. And he is going to spark the change today with his talk called Rethinking Transformation. I think even before I get into the talk, I'd just like to say it's interesting because last year for Spark the Change Toronto, without going to Toronto, not having a visa, not doing my flights, not doing my hotels, I actually attended 2 days of Spark Toronto by sitting in Pune. It was such a fascinating experience, and yes, I said hi to Rich there, where you were also, in the Spark Toronto setup. And it was an interesting experience for me to see the value that I could get even sitting in India via a robot, making the interactions that I wouldn't have probably got if I, let's say, even didn't attend it. Cost is one thing, but I think the value through the Spark Talks, and Jason has been the biggest inspiration for me for getting Spark the Change to India. So thank you, Jason.
You're welcome.
So with that, I think I'd just like to quote a few things that Jason generally says, especially about robots. So he looks at robots basically with, I think you said the other day, collaboration without borders with robots. And what used to be physical barriers aren't any physical barriers anymore. So it's much more than just a video conference for me, because he is live here, yes, but he's also able to move the robot around with a few technical glitches that we will fix off and on, but it works. And I don't need to be physically present here to say, oh, Jason, look at this and look at that, because he can listen into everything himself. He can move the neck of the robot, and he's there. So I'm going to let Jason now take over with his talk on rethinking transformation. A bit on that talk. All change follows the laws of social change, as Jason says, no matter what we hope it's going to be, or no matter what we think it should be. Maybe it's just that the change is not as linear as we expect it to be, right? And with that, Jason, I'll let you start your Spark talk. So welcome, Jason. Welcome to India.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So the one thing I will do is I'm going to turn the audio down on my side, because I can hear myself in my room, and then I can hear the echo coming back from your room. So if anything happens and my audio goes out or anything like that, just have somebody wave in front of the camera so I'll know.
To shut our audio or mute it for a while?
Nope, that's okay.
Okay.
All right, so it got very dark there all of a sudden. All right. So is this coming through on the screen okay? Excellent. All right. So thank you very much for having me. Again, my name is Jason Little, and a quick background. I started my career as a developer. So back when Cold Fusion roamed the earth, if anyone remembers the Cold Fusion language, and I kind of fell into change work, um, I guess backwards from how most change practitioners get into this type of work. So in the early 2000s, I started working with my first agile teams, and the trigger for me to think about agile in particular as change and organizational change was a conversation I had with a senior coach. I'll put senior coach in air quotes, and a senior manager. And this senior manager had a problem in production, and he wanted us to create this complex set of rules and sign off and checklists, basically so he could create a trail of blame for um, whoever created this production problem. And the senior coach I was working with um, kind of started yelling and swearing at this poor manager that he was not doing it right and wasn't thinking about things the right way. So I don't want to use the language that she was using. And it got me thinking about, why are we here trying to push change on an organization that isn't ready and doesn't really seem like they want to do this? So that got me started down the whole path of thinking about how we introduce change in our organizations. And it's pretty interesting to see when I started doing some research, most of the popular approaches that we have for change today were created before the internet. And we can't possibly expect some of these project management type of thinking models to help us with the complexity of today's change. So this talk I first did this as a keynote in Montreal, Agile Montreal a few years ago, and it's evolved quite a bit since then because it's such a complex topic. So first, I want to just talk a little bit about how we have hundreds and hundreds of change models out there. If you Google organizational change models, you're going to find so many little loopy diagrams and arrows and boxes and process models pointing all over the place. And we've had this stuff for decades. So is there really anything left to invent? Is there anything that we really need to think about from a process perspective? A lot of these models, they follow kind of a linear path, which is we do some kind of planning, assessment, awareness, we execute the change, we use our change best practices, we close the project down, and if we just follow the process right, everything will work. So has anyone worked in any kind of change where everything has gone according to plan? I know I haven't. But we like these models because our brains have such a strong desire for certainty. And this is a quick test for you. So if you tend to follow the same path to work every day, starting next week, take a different path to work every day, and then make a little note about how your brain feels and kind of what your state of mind is when you get there. You'll feel more alert. I know there's times when, if you're commuting and you get to work and you kind of get to your desk and you think, how did I get here? You go on autopilot. So we like these linear approaches. We like to feel that there is a natural starting, middle, and end point to change. When we say there is a current state and a transition and a future state, or we need to unfreeze and change and refreeze, these steps in these linear models give us a feeling of certainty, but they don't help us move and navigate through the complexities of today's change. So we need to think about it a different way. So it's pretty stressful if we don't know what the future holds. Another quick test is think of assuming you had no commitments on Monday, who would just leave right after this conference, head to the airport and pick a flight and just go somewhere without planning it or thinking about it? For some people, that creates a lot of stress and anxiety. And other people, sure, they'd have no problem doing that. But we still want some level of certainty. So I'm going to talk about four main things today. And we tend to think that we need to get everybody to buy into this change, and then we need to get everybody to execute this change. We need to communicate to everybody, and then everybody will kind of be progressing through this change at the same rate and intensities. And we know it doesn't work that way. So the four main things are how people process those changes differently, and how it never happens in a linear way, like a lot of our models suggest. And what can we do and look for in how social change happens, and how can we leverage that to create an approach for change in our organizations that's most likely to work? Because it's change follows the same social patterns. We have people who are influencers, we have people who are inspirers, we have people who just know how to rally other people to get them kind of on board and creating a movement around this change. And it happens the same way in our organizations. But we want to sort of take the human element out of it and create these linear plans and process models, but it doesn't really work that way. And then I'm also going to talk about how change is really shaped through relationships. And I was in one organization, a large organization, where, out of the 1,400 people, there were maybe 3 who wanted to do this change. And one of them was the VP, the guy who was at the top of the organization. And he was probably one of the best executives I've ever worked with. But the problem was he was really one of the 3 that wanted this to work. So there wasn't enough momentum to get this change over the hill, so to speak. So we can focus on what are our relationships like with people around us in the organization, and use that as a way to figure out how do we move our changes forward. So let's just try a quick experiment. So you should have some handouts at your tables, and you can do this in groups. And what I want you to do is I want you to think of a change that is something that you started. So it could be if you've ever quit a job and went somewhere else, or you moved to a new city or a new country, but something you had control of and something that you started. I don't want to know what the change is, just what was your reaction to it? Did it make you anxious? Was it stressful? Did it make you happy? And then the other part of the exercise is think of a change that happened to you. So if anyone was around in the early 2000s when the dot-com era sort of fell off of a cliff and your organization went under, or you were downsized, or you were forced to relocate, what was your reaction to that? Did that make you happy? Did it make you feel relieved? Did it make you feel mad? So I don't want what the change was, just what the reaction was. And on the left side of the page, that's where you'll put your responses for the internal changes. And on the right side of the page are the external ones. And then at a table, maybe have 6 or 7 responses on each side, and put the more positive ones closer to the top and the more negative ones towards the bottom. So just take about 5 minutes or so, have a little conversation at the table. Again, doesn't matter what the change was, just something that you started versus something that happened to you.
All right, okay, Jason.
All right. So I want to find out what are some things you notice about what you wrote down and the pattern that looks the pattern that's emerged on the page. So what did you notice about that exercise?
Would anyone like to share? I'm there.
So I observe that the more of internal change is more in the happier side, and kind of the external change is kind of towards the negative side. That's my observation.
Okay.
You could hear that, Jason, right? Clearly.
Yeah.
So we have one more person wanting to share.
We found that sort of regardless whether it was internal or external, there was a excitement was a common theme, a sort of a curiosity and looking forward to the change itself, whether it was a merger or a transformation or a promotion.
Sharika?
Yeah, could you hear that one, Jason?
Yes.
Okay, so one more.
Any others?
Yeah.
Jason, at our table, it's Andrea here, we heard two stories from two participants, and it was interesting to explore that it was a mixture of feelings on both scenarios, and it was very dynamic as the participants processed the change over time. The emotions changed over time as well.
Okay.
Shall I go? Hi. The common themes that emerged from this table was that change did bring about some kind of anxiety and uncertainty, and it was a stressful time when they were going through the change. But on hindsight, looking back now, there were feelings of happiness, there were feelings of learning and sharing, and there was this, through the passage of time, from the negative to the positive has emerged. That's what has come out of this table.
Okay, Jason.
Okay. So the interesting thing is, as change practitioners, so I'll just do a quick poll. If you're an external coach or an external consultant, raise your hand. Okay, so it's probably what, a quarter of the room?
Yes.
So the interesting thing is, you probably see all this stuff all over LinkedIn and everywhere that everybody's afraid of change. Everybody, they go through anger and frustration and depression, and we have to overcome this resistance, and we have to help them in this type of stuff. But it's really kind of our perception as outsider practitioners, and it's not often the reality. I mean, there's you can see that even if it's a change you don't control, there's positive responses to it. Sometimes it's like, oh, thankfully, finally somebody wants to do something about this. So even though it's not a change that I had control over, it was still a positive response. So everybody is sort of progressing through a change at different rates and different intensities. And we're kind of, as change practitioners, trying to figure out how do we navigate through this. But there's no solitary truth. The story that I told a bit earlier, no one really cared. I mean, it was just apathy. So there was no anger or frustration or resistance. No one had time and no one cared, or not enough people did to make it work. So we didn't continue on with the change. So it's always different. I like to say it's, trying to change an organization is sort of like trying to change a Rubik's Cube, but one that is made out of LEDs. So as you're solving the Rubik's Cube, the colors are changing. It's just a constant puzzle that keeps changing, but there is no truth. I mean, whether it's something you have control over or not, the emotional reactions and responses to change, they're going to be all over the board. But the patterns do show. I've done this exercise hundreds of times all over the world, and the patterns are very similar to what's on screen. So if it's something you have more control over, it's more likely to be positive. But it's not true 100% of the time. So the idea is that by rethinking transformation, let's not have our change team locked in an office for 6 months creating a perfect plan only to unleash it on an organization that's not ready for it. How do we co-create, and how do we involve them in creating this plan and move away from managing change and move towards facilitating change? So I've never been a fan of resistance to change. There's only a response. Sometimes it's going to be positive. Sometimes it's going to be negative. But it's really, I find resistance is something that we as change agents are creating. So it's the approach that we're taking that might not be compatible with the organization, or it might not be the right time, or it might not be the right change. It's more complex than just to think that if we don't see change happening, it's because those other people are resisting. It never works that way. It's more complex. The other thing I like to think about is I worked in an organization that was acquired once. So I remember having, organizational changes inflicted on me as well. So sitting at your desk, our company was acquired, and I found out that I had been given a new job because there were business cards on my desk. So I came in the morning, and the stack of business cards was sitting there, and I picked them up and went, "What are these?" And they said, "Oh, you're the new director of storefront development." I'm like, "Woohoo, what does that mean?" And then the leadership from the other company came in and started wanting to do things their way. So of course, I resisted from their perspective. But for me, it was, well, who are these guys? Right? We've been running this company for a year and a half now. We know what we're doing. We know what's best. So you have to really feel what it's like to go through that, and then you'll have empathy for people in organizations who, when we come in as change practitioners, think it's that same response. We have to let that response die down before we can move the change forward. So there's sort of different triggers for changes. And when we get locked into this kind of linear approach for change, there's a starting point, a middle point, and an ending point. I really like to think about it as little pockets of moments. So there are events or triggers for change that are happening constantly. So I see this a lot in organizations, especially large ones over here in Canada that I work with, when somebody wants to bring in an innovation program, or they want to bring in an agile transformation, or they want to reshuffle their teams. That's one moment and one sort of thread of change that's happening. And then there's a natural opposite reaction that's happening. So usually you'll hear, the people who don't think it's a good idea for this change, they're sort of the drop that's bouncing back in the rainstorm. So we think they're being resistant, but really they're just reacting to something that they might just not think is a good idea. I worked in lots of organizations where some people, they just think the change is stupid, and we label them as resistors because we're not really listening to what they need or what input they have for the change. So we've got all these ripple effects and these unintended consequences that we can't control with a linear plan. I worked in one organization that wanted to try to build an agile framework so they could run agile projects. And of course, the people who didn't like that way of working, they immediately started creating something that was completely opposite to what the agile team was trying to create. So it's sort of a natural reaction. People that don't think the change is a good idea, they're not resisting it. They think their way is better. So we need to engage in that conversation versus labeling them as resistors and trying to overcome this resistance through brute force, because it will never work that way. You might get a small little benefit, and then things will go back to the way they were if we don't have good enough relationships with people across different levels in the organization. So it change kind of happens in waves. And again, if you separate how external coaches or change agents think about change, if I go into an organization and say, I can't guarantee any of this stuff is going to work. Here's the approach that we're going to take. We're not going to have a year-long roadmap about how we're going to roll this stuff out. First thing we need to do are these 3 experiments. We need to try this. You'll never get hired. So in one case, it's we're selling this idea of certainty, but we know it doesn't work that way. It kind of, there's usually lots of momentum at the start. Things are going well. And then we start to realize how much of our organization is affected by this change. And then we really understand how hard it's going to be. And then we go, oh my God, this is going to be too hard. We can't do it. And then we kind of fall down to the bottom of this first wave where we need to do an intervention. There's a large bank in Sweden I work with every so often, and we do annual interventions. So they call them a summit. So every year we get a couple of hundred people together, and it's usually opt-in. So there's a small percentage of leaders that are invited, and then it's open to the rest of the organization. And it's sort of the way for us to close the chapter on what happened over the previous year and open up the new one. So we're trying to move to quarterly interventions as well. But change kind of works that way. Lots of momentum, things die off, we get into a rut, and then we need a strong trigger or intervention to kind of reinvigorate it. And the reason why I call this rethinking transformation is because people in organizations have the luxury of time. So you can sort of wait a few weeks or a couple of months for a change to take hold. But as externals, you kind of have to be doing stuff all the time. And one of the questions I get a lot in my change course is things like, a lot of the activities we do is because we have some sponsor who's nagging us to do stuff. So we just invent work to do, so it looks like we're doing stuff. But we know sometimes you just have to wait and see how change shakes out. But it's always that kind of wave. And then after we do the intervention, we go back up the hill again. There's a lot of momentum. There's energy. Things are happening. We're seeing victories. Then we hit the next hard problem and we crash down again. So I like to have this rule with some of the coaches I work with is never be the first consultants in there, because it will never work and you'll get the blame for everything. So always be the third one. So a really good interview question is, how many times have you tried this before? If they said, yeah, well, we had consultancy X in here 3 years ago and consultancy Y last year, and now we're ready to go for it again, then absolutely take it, because now they're ready for the change. But if they say, well, we're just starting out, you'll just say, oh, sorry, our schedule is busy, we can't do it. I've seen this so many times. Being the first one in there is just the worst. So when we think about transformational change, if you've probably seen the picture of that, the caterpillar morphing into this beautiful butterfly. But does anybody really know what happens in that process? It completely breaks down all of its cells and rebuilds itself. It's a pretty nasty process, but the end result looks pretty cool. So we latch on to these transformation words and things like this, and it sounds good and it feels good. But a lot of times it's a pretty ugly process, and it always follows the same patterns as change does in our societies. So when we first start transformational change, things start to emerge. There's not a lot of organization around it. it's usually the, the innovators or the movers or the people who always leap into action. And we need those kind of crazy disruptor people to shake things up through emergence. So they're the ones that are kind of going around and poking the organization and disturbing things to see how it reacts, but it's not really formal. We kind of have a good idea about why we're doing this, but we're not exactly sure, and we don't have a really well-formed plan yet, but we need to try a few things out. So as things emerge, we start to disturb the rest of the organization, and then there's the feeling that we need to get this under control. I have seen this in every agile transformation I've worked in, where basically at some point, somebody high enough in the organization looks around and goes, hey, wait a minute, this looks like chaos. We need to get those people under control. I need a VP of Agile in here, and I need a 5-year roadmap, and I need this, that, and the other. And we have this desire to create more structure. So we start to form official transformation teams, and we start to create strategic pillars, and we start to create SharePoint sites and put a lot of organization and stuff around it. And usually the people who worked very well in emergence to disturb things, they start getting a little nervous. They're like, well, wait a minute. No, we can't do this. This isn't an innovative way to do it. So we start to create some friction in the organization. And then we can take things a little bit too far and we can institutionalize it. So if you think of, if we're trying to bring in an innovation program, but we use our mandated project management methodology to make it happen, those things are not compatible with each other. We're applying the same values as what we did in the old world to try and change and transform to this new state. It just doesn't work that way. But it's really that, when I mentioned around the uncertainty at the beginning, it's that uncertainty. So we want to sterilize it and standardize it because that makes us feel good. And then the last stage is decline. So now this is where the change might have worked, but we didn't notice. So I see hundreds of small successes in organizations I work with, but we tend to gloss over them because we're expecting this massive, awesome, positive transformation, and we kind of lose sight of those really small, cool victories. One company I worked for, we spent 2 days doing a deep product discovery session. So they have this new project with revenue projections and all this kind of cool stuff. And they thought it was going to take them, maybe, what was it? 14. It was about 14 weeks to finish it. So we spent 2 days digging into what it would actually take, and they realized it was going to be about a year. And after those 2 days, they killed the project. They decided it wasn't worth spending that much money on it. And first of all, they were mad at me because they brought in the expert and I couldn't fix their problem. So they were mad at me for a while. But once that shock wore off, they realized, oh, that's actually a good thing. We would have wasted millions of dollars building this thing and probably wouldn't have got a return for it. So that's a huge success. But we sweep it under the rug and we look at, well, that manager's not being agile enough. And then the other part in decline is failure, where it just didn't work for whatever reason. And us change people, we have this nasty 70% stat that we keep throwing around, which is nonsense. 70% of changes fail, we'll say. That's a myth. That's like a unicorn. It doesn't exist. There's enough data that's debunked that. But we're so attached to that failure because we can say change fails, therefore you have to hire me because I can ensure successful change. If it doesn't work, just drop it. Drop the baggage, try again and move on. Don't worry about the conditions or why. If we're talking about transformational change, we don't really care about looking back. We are always looking to the future. So drop the baggage, try again. Co-optation is the state where we use the values of the old organization to try and transform into a new state. So if we want to be a more innovative company, we create another level of hierarchy and big documents describing our innovation process. So we're sort of using the old way of doing things to try and transform to a new state. And then on the right side is repression, where it was just too hard, so we went back to the old way, or it became the new norm. So if you're interested in the model behind this, this is the work of Herbert Bloomer, who talked about the stages of social change. And if you stop and look around and what happens in society, especially what happens in government, our organizations tend to reflect how our society operates. And we always underestimate that. We think that our organizations work based on processes that we install, but they don't. The change in our organizations follows this exact same pattern. So when we start with emergence, we need to enable the movers. So Benjamin Franklin said there's only 3 types of people in the world. There's those who move, there's those that are movable, and there's those that are immovable. So if there are any musicians in the crowd, you'll probably know who this guy is, Eddie Van Halen, who inspired thousands of guitar players all over the world. So he's known as a mover because he started doing crazy stuff that people couldn't even comprehend back in the 70s. So he unlocked this entire universe of a different way of even annotating guitar music and how to play different things. And he blew up so many amps and destroyed so much equipment by experimenting to try things out. And so many people have mimicked his style over the last 40 years. It's crazy. So we have movers in our organizations too. Those are the people that sort of run amok and disturb things. If we don't have these people who are biased towards action, change will not happen ever. Change doesn't happen based on a cool looking PowerPoint or, you know, a good set of strategic pillars. It happens when people take action. So we need these people to spark enough movement to get things moving. Then we've got the movables. So there was one organization I worked in where we were working with a group of managers, and they said, well, you know, we kind of want to wait and see what happens, because the way things work around here is the people who take action and change things, they get in trouble first. So we want to wait and see what happens first. So those are the movables. They can be convinced once they see evidence something is happening. So the movers, they kind of instinctively get it. They align to the change right away. You don't have to sell them anything. They're going to take whatever this change is and they're going to run with it 100 miles an hour. The movables, they need evidence. They'll say things like, oh, shut up, consultant. You don't know what it's like around here. At least in North America, they'll say that a lot, but they might say it in a little more of a harsh way sometimes. But I'm sure as a change person, you've probably heard people say, now, listen, that sounds great on paper and in theory, but that'll never work around here because of X. But as soon as these movables, they see evidence, they're like, oh, you know what? I never thought about it that way. Maybe it might work. And that's going to take time. That you cannot govern that with a change resistance mitigation strategy. That is simply trying to create moments where these movables can be convinced. So one organization I worked for, we only worked with the early adopters or the movers because they were the people that said, yep, we want the external consultants here working with our teams. So we will do anything they say. When we moved on to the next wave of teams, instead of coming in and trying to sell them for the change, we just came in and trained them on the approach. And then we said, okay, we're going to now bring in team A. They've been doing this for the last 6 months. So we're going to bring them in and they can tell you some stories about how they got this stuff to work in your company. So we sort of stepped back out of the process and let it spread virally in kind of a natural way, because they're not going to listen to us, but they're going to listen to people who are insiders. They're going to listen to people who are part of the herd, if you know what I mean. Like humans are herding creatures. They're going to listen to people who are their own. They're not going to listen to us as outsiders. And then there's rarity. Rarity doesn't like any of this type of stuff. Rarity is a skeptic, a negative skeptic, and it doesn't really matter what you try or what you want to do. Rarity is going to say, that'll never work here. And if a change doesn't work exactly the way you thought it was, Rarity is going to say, I told you so. So we don't really want to worry about them. And in the change world, we are super guilty of this. Everything on LinkedIn is negative. How do we overcome resistors? How do we, oh, it's those resistors. People resist change. Let them vent and then leave them alone. Put all of your energy into the movers and the pockets of movables who are going to help you virally spread this change. Forget about trying to convince the immovables to do this thing. They're never going to. My experience is that they either opt out entirely, so they leave the organization fast, or maybe eventually they'll come around. So there's the idea that even the harshest skeptic can become the most positive supporter. I've seen that a couple of times, but don't let the negative energy of the immovables kill the motivation of the change. So the interesting thing is that the stance of these three groups are changing over time. So during emergence, that's where the movers are taking action. They're just running with it. They have to have broad personal networks. So change spreads virally through relationships. And a really good story from John Seeley Brown, if anyone remembers a company called Xerox, their Park research facility. So he was the leader of that innovation program in the 70s, and they arguably made the laptop economically viable. They invented the mouse and a whole bunch of other things that they made $0 from. And in his own words, he said the reason why none of this worked is we had an awesome research facility. We had the best and the brightest. We had all the budget. We had the coolest technology. He didn't work on any relationships with his peers, and his peers made all the money for the company. So he was just kind of perceived as some nut that was over in another building doing some stuff that no one really cared about, even though it was really cool stuff. But it was relationships. It had nothing to do with the things that we normally think makes change work. Having a budget, having a nice innovative space, having pool tables. This is horrible in North America. They think if we put a foosball table in the middle of our team room, they're going to innovate. It's ridiculous. It's relationships. That's what makes change spread virally. Having good, solid, established relationships and large influence networks. So during emergence, we need those movers. We need to take the shackles off and let them run amok, establish those relationships, and help spread it virally. The movables, like I said, they're going to wait and see. They're going to kind of sit on the fence. They're going to need some evidence. And then the rarities of the world, they might be kind of active in their resistance where they're actively trying to undermine the change, or they might just, I'll do the bare minimum so I won't get in trouble. But as soon as it doesn't work, I'm going to say I told you so. And they might have also just had a bad experience with a similar change, so they just don't think it's going to work. When we move into coalescence, that's where the movers start to get a little bit nervous. So there's more structure than I'm comfortable with. So this is not cool. So I need to lash out and act more because this just doesn't fit with the way that I think things should be done around here. The movables, the ones that are sitting on the fence, they might start to align more towards the change or further away against it. But they might be the ones that you actually need to enlist, because once a change hits a critical mass, you need people that can put a little bit more structure around it to take it to the next level. Because the people who value action and the movers, that's not their strength. Their strength is disrupting and kicking up dust. And then rarity might opt out entirely. So she might just leave, or she might be starting to think, I kind of understand this now, so I'm going to kind of start to become a mover. Once we hit bureaucratization, the movers really start to get defensive. I've seen this especially in agile transformations. The agile early adopters usually quit and go to a different organization. I've seen 2 instances of entire change teams in an agile context just leave within the same month because it's now become too formal. And it's compromised their values, and they just leave. The movables might be sinking into a status quo, so they feel a little bit more certainty. They start to game the system a little bit. And on the bad side, they might just become maliciously compliant. And what that means is they're just they're following along with the change, even if it's getting the wrong outcome, basically so they can say, well, sorry, that's what it's supposed to be. That's what the process is, and we followed it, so that's your problem. Once we get into decline, like I mentioned, those two change teams I worked with previously, they left the organization within a month in 2 cases. So once things start to decline, people who like change and they value action, the status quo just gets boring sometimes, and they need something else to satisfy their own values and the way that they think about change. The movables like to sink into the routines. They're just, okay, the noise has died down, I can go back to work and get my work done. I don't have to think about this new innovation program anymore. I can just kind of go back on autopilot and in cruise control. And then the rarities, the ones that haven't left the organization, they're happy things are back to normal and they've kind of moved into a I told you so kind of mentality. So a linear plan can't manage these dynamics. It's just not possible, because the people are kind of progressing through all of these stages at different rates and in different intensities. But as the change is unfolding, we love the idea of current state, future state. It doesn't exist. It's constant evolution. But when we say it that way, it doesn't make us feel good that we have certainty about where it is that we're going. So, we take action sooner, because if we get our change people locked in a room for 3 months, by the time they're done with the change plan, the current reality is completely different. So it's almost pointless to use that plan that took so long to get created. So we're kind of, as change people, stuck in the middle of this constantly changing reality. And we need a different frame for how we look at stuff. So it's, it's like watching a movie about time travel. It gets confusing very quickly. If you use the sort of the Agile community as an example, the people who were early adopters in the early 2000s are now early adopters of the next movement of stuff. And all of the big companies, especially here in Canada, because Agile's the huge thing nowadays with all the banks and insurance companies here, they're calling themselves the innovators and early adopters of Agile, but in a different time, 17 years later. So it's kind of like a really bad time traveling movie. You can't really follow these threads, and our linear change plans can't help us through these complex problems. So there's something that we can try to figure out, how do we navigate through this mess. So there's another handout you guys should have on your tables. And this is kind of an individual exercise. If you're sitting at a table with somebody who you work with, you could pair up and try this one out. But we want to try to create some kind of an influence map. If we focus on the relationships about how we're going to spread this change. And again, like I mentioned, if you're inside the organization, you have more of a luxury of time. You can sort of plant seeds and help them grow. But if you're external and you only have a 3-month-long contract, your urgency is substantially different from the urgency of the people in the organizations. So I want you to use this, and again, do it individually or pair up, and start from where you are. So the little icon would represent you. So if you think of a change that you're working in, or a change that is kind of being brought into your organization that you don't have control over, but you believe in, who and what is within your sphere of influence? Who are some people that you can establish relationships with that are going to help you virally spread this change? And then who are the people that they influence? So there was one example. You should be able to see up on the screen here what your diagram might look like. I was working in one organization that wanted to bring in Agile, and I was part of the Agile coaching team, and people had come to us and asked us why we were still doing traditional project management training, why people were being sent to that. So I went and talked to my director and said, "Oh, do you know somebody in the learning and development area? Because we've got people coming to us with this problem, and we have alternate suggestions for training." So she said, "Yeah, I know Patty." And I was trying to think of a fake name because Patty is her real name. Um, and I went and talked to Patty and just said, "Oh, we're trying this new agile process stuff. It's a different way to make software. And how do we get our courses on the official training curriculum to give people a choice?" So she told me how that process worked, and I gave her all the information. And then I said, "Oh, and if you have anybody that applies for these 5 traditional things, can you tell them that there's an alternative because we're not using those process models anymore?" So I didn't have direct control over any of this. I found this path of influence and found how the norms worked in that organization and swam with the current instead of against it. It would have been pretty easy for me to go to the directors in IT and say, "Now you're resisting change. You should be doing this and you should be doing that." But that's never going to take you where you want to go. So you can use this influence map to try and figure out where are the areas of the organization you need to influence and how do you get there? How do you swim with the current of the organizations instead of against it? So, Sarika, what are we going to take, about 5 to 10 minutes for them to do this, either individually or in pairs?
Right, we do 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I know that's a short period of time. You know, this might be an exercise, you know, it might take an hour to do with some people on your change team or other movers. So I wanted to just show you a quick example of one that had been created previously. This was a few years ago. And looking at, is this diagram coming through okay? Really messy, doesn't look like it makes any sense to anybody diagram? Yes. So that's kind of the point. On the outside looking at this, I know exactly what this means because I was part of creating it. But if you're looking at it on the outside, it just looks like a big mess. But what we had done is gone through in the different colors there, the green, the red, and the orange, that represents the movers, movables, and immovables. And how the relationships worked in the path of influence for this particular change. So it's an artifact to sort of think through. People react to change for some reason. There's something in the past that happened with a similar type of change. Could be things like, who knows? You never know if somebody just got an fender bender on the way to work and they're in a bad mood. So when you do your change strategy presentation and they react in a negative way, they might just be in a bad mood. So there's always something else going on underneath. But we tend to immediately leap to that person. But this at least helps you figure out, you know, where are the boundaries for me as the change agent? Where are some areas where I should maybe not worry about yet because I don't have any influence in that area or I don't know anyone there? How am I going to sort of facilitate my way through this change and create a Google map for myself to navigate through it? So the person who had this problem was Richard Atherton. He's a friend of mine in the UK. And I showed him this picture. We did a podcast together probably a couple of years after he created it. And he remembered exactly what the dynamics were like there. So the process of creating that diagram is the important part, and it might take you a lot longer than 5 minutes to do it. How are we for time?
We're just pretty good with time. So it's 2 minutes past, so we still have time for like 8 minutes of Q&A.
Okay, perfect.
So if you want to just switch back to, from slide mode. Yep. Okay, so we've got 8 minutes Q&A. Any questions for Jason?
Hi Jason, this is Prakash here.
Hi.
Hi. So, a few minutes back you mentioned that when rather than managing change, we should be looking at facilitating change, and we should try to hear out what people actually want rather than trying to push our case through. Now, my experience in past at times has been when we start engaging with people and trying to understand their part of the story, a lot of times it's more about me than the organization. And what they want is probably to safeguard their position in the organization or what they are doing in the organization rather than looking at things which would improve or which would be better for the organization. Now, how do you handle such situations?
So let me reflect the question back to make sure I got it, because there's a bit of echo. So was it around the change people making the change more about them and less about the people?
People trying to, when we talk to people and trying to understand their perspective about change or what they want, and then you think through what they are asking for. It's more about safeguarding their position in the organization rather than looking at how the organization will move forward. So when we say that we should be facilitating change and trying to understand what people want, it probably does not help us take the organization forward. Rather, it looks at safeguarding individuals and their positions out there.
Okay, so it doesn't help move the change forward when we're taking a facilitation stance.
That's my experience in past. So just wanted to understand your perspective about it, or in case you have faced such situations in past.
Yeah. So the one that I mentioned at the start around this department of about 1,400, where the VP was one of the best executives I work with, but he was one of 3 people that wanted to do it. So I always default to a coaching and facilitation stance. And after a couple of months, we weren't making any traction at all. So I just had a frank conversation with him to say, it really doesn't seem like anybody's interested in doing this. If you really want it to work, you're going to have to put some brute force behind it. So you're going to have to assign 2 people from each division who have political clout to move this thing forward. So he did, and we tried that, and it didn't really go anywhere either. And part of it is understanding what market the organization is in. So this was in banking, in capital markets. If anybody's worked in capital markets before, it's not a very nice, warm, fuzzy, friendly kind of environment to be in. It's very high stress, and delivery always matters first. And the other part is what's the culture of the organization like, and what region is the organization in as well. So nationality comes into play as well. So if you look at power distance index, for example, I do a lot of work in the Nordics, for example, and in Finland in particular, it's a very low power distance index. So there is absolutely no problem with, a junior developer talking to a CEO and saying, why are we doing this? This doesn't make sense. I don't understand it. And in other cultures, you can't do that. So part of it is sort of using this approach to figure out which approach to change is most likely to work for us. I always default to facilitation, but then we have to have a conversation around how important is this change. And if we need to manage it in a different way, then we have to do it in a different way. But I never assume that it has to be forced first. There's usually a window of opportunity that opens at some point that leads to kind of a more co-creative way of doing it. We just have to find that avenue.
Does that help answer your question, Prakash? We have 2 more questions, Jason.
Hi, Jason. I'm Vikas here. My question is more about social change rather than organization change. So one of the challenges which I see happening is whenever you have a new change you want to start or lead, it's kind of navigating the cacophony which is there on the social media now. And how do you kind of even get your idea out so that people can actually hear it out, make a positive assessment, or enroll people to facilitate that change in their communities or in their ecosystems. So this is something which has been on my mind for a long time. So if you have any perspectives or experiences to share, that would be helpful.
Okay, so could I summarize the question as how to approach change by finding the right ways to enlist people into the movement?
Yeah, and especially in a social change outside the boundaries of an organization.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. In that context, it's finding the people who are the most passionate about whatever that change is and going to where those people are. In organization, I those to go visit other companies that are So I've brought plenty of clients, new clients to old clients, just to go to people. Social context, so outside of the organization, it's things like meetups, finding demonstrations, um, finding where these people are, going to where they communicate. And that's sort of something that I see in and outside of organizations. So if it's a social change outside an organization, or even something in an organization, when we think about how we make people aware and help build that passion, we tend to push communication out to them. So I see a lot of things happening in social change where it's, hey, look, we created a Slack channel, come and talk to us. That will never work. We need to find where these people are and communicate how they communicate and where they communicate. One of the org change courses I took, the professor said, if you really want to know what makes an organization tick, start smoking. And he said, because when you're out with the smokers, that's where you get the most diverse group of people. You get people from all levels in the organization. And then, of course, he said, no, I'm not advocating starting smoking, but you know what I mean. And I did a talk in Finland a few weeks ago, and one of the executives there said when they redesigned their office, they moved the main coffee machine to an area that was most likely to create collisions with people who normally didn't interact with each other, to make those connections.
One more question.
Hi, I'm Geeta, and we're invested in a small company. It's no longer a startup. It's been around for almost 10 years. But it started out as friends and family who got together with an idea and started the company. And now, after 10 years, through various technology shifts, product shifts, market shifts, they've reached a situation where one or two people are not really being able to pull the team along, or they're not able to deliver what needs to be delivered. But being related or being very, very close in relationship, it's very difficult for the CEO to tell this person to go out, because there are other implications of a fallout here in that other individual's own social setup, or, you know, in India at least, family, society have a lot of bearing to one's decisions. Have you come across situations, or can you guide, you know, give some pointers as to how we can handle it? And being a startup, they can't really engage, you know, big consultants. So it's, as investors, we need to step in as the change agents.
I caught part of that, but there was quite a bit of echo. Could you summarize it, the question, in a bullet point and ask it again?
How do we bring about change when the constraints have, or when a constraint is on account of a family relationship? How does one bring about a change in an organization when it can actually disrupt family relationships?
So when it disrupts a family relationship. Okay. I actually had a change just like that about 10-ish years ago or so, where the two company founders were brothers. So the CEO and the CTO. And we came in to help them move to an agile way of working. And I'm not going to use the language that the CEO used, but our first interview was with the two brothers, and the CEO said, I want to know where the blank my $10 million in IT spend is going, because I'm sure is blank, 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 not getting any software out of it. So there was already a bad relationship between the two brothers, or some animosity. And we got thrown right in the middle of that. And So we went to data. We tried to take the emotion out of it and went and did some exploratory work about why it was so hard to deliver stuff, and then brought the data back. Those are, yeah, those are not nice situations to be in. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's moonwalk out of that one. Just it's too emotionally charged. I mean, especially if you're the outsider trying to change something where there's a weird family dynamic involved. I don't know.
All right. Thanks, Jason. That was very, very interesting. Okay, so I think we're good with questions for now. Jason, is there anything else that you wanted to share, or then we will thank you?
No, I just want to say thanks for inviting me. I always find the remote ones a little more difficult than being in the room, but this is pretty cool. And I guess the last point is around whenever you hear people talk about how people resist change, if you look at where our societies are as a planet, I mean, I'm in Canada attending a conference in India by a robot. If people resisted change, we would not evolve as a society and as people. So find out what's in it for the people who want this change to happen, and worry about the movers. Forget the resistors.
All right, thank you, Jason. So before we let you go, Jason, we would like to thank you with a small token of appreciation. And I'm not sure what you would see, but can you see what I'm showing you? What do you see?
Oh, that's cool. Spark the Change India 2018. Organize, Unleash, Disrupt. That's awesome.
So that's, yeah, now it's for everybody here to see. So that's Jason, a caricature of Jason.
That's very cool.
And we have 2 other small things for you.
Oh, that's awesome.
And thank you for being an awesome robot speaker for us.
Thank you.
And a small token of appreciation with that. And we'd like to say every revolution begins with a spark. And that's something that you would hopefully keep at your desk and be even more inspired for Spark Change Toronto this year.
Excellent. Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you again, Jason. It's been wonderful having you here.
Thank you.
Have you logged off, Jason?
Not
yet.
Do you want me to log off?
Yeah, no. So I just had to tell you. So this will arrive via AWB number, whatever the flight number Rich travels with. So that's the AWB number it goes with. So thank you, Rich, for taking it to Toronto. I didn't ask you, but I'm sending it.